June, 1462. The air over the plain near Targoviste, the capital of Wallachia, is thick and heavy. It smells of death, decay, and fear. This is not a metaphor. Tens of thousands of flies drone in the scorching silence, creating a monotonous, maddening hum. Before the army of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, a titan of his time, lies a sight capable of breaking the spirit of even the most hardened Janissaries. For 3 kilometers, a monstrous, unthinkable forest stretches out. But instead of trees, stakes jut from the earth. Thousands, tens of thousands of sharpened poles, and on each one, in different poses of agony, decompose the bodies of captured Turks. 20,000 people, men, women, children, impaled, raised to the sky in a silent, eternal scream. In the center of this apocalyptic installation, on the highest stake, the remains of Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman commander, are still recognizable. The Sultan, who had seen the fall of the greatest city in Christendom, a man whose name was synonymous with conquest and power, turns away. The chronicles report, he said, "It is impossible to take a country from a man who is capable of such things." This was not fear of an army. It was a primal horror of the will of one man, the Prince of Wallachia, Vlad III, son of the dragon. It is here, in this foul forest of the dead, that our central paradox is born. For the Turks, it was the work of the devil. For Europe, it was shocking barbarism. But for the Wallachians, it was an act of salvation, the loudest and clearest possible signal to the enemy. This land will cost you more than you can pay. How did the defender of the faith reach a point where his main argument in a theological and geopolitical dispute became a forest of rotting bodies? To understand this, we must return to the world that spawned this monster savior. To fully grasp the genesis of Vlad Tepes, one must dive into the geopolitical cauldron of the mid-15th century, a world standing on a tectonic fault line between civilizations. The great Byzantine Empire, the 1,000-year bastion of orthodoxy, was now no more than a shadow of its former greatness, an agonizing ghost whose capital, Constantinople, was living out its last days, surrounded on all sides by the relentlessly expanding Ottoman Empire. This new, young, and passionate force, led by brilliant and ruthless sultans, was not just a military threat. It was an avalanche sweeping away the old world order. The Ottomans were masters not only of war, but of governance. They assimilated and subjugated peoples with frightening efficiency. Their Janissary corps was the most perfect infantry of the time, and their artillery could shatter walls once thought impregnable. To the west, the Catholic world was fractured by internal conflicts. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of hundreds of feuding principalities. The Kingdom of Hungary, the region's most powerful state, played a complex political game, constantly balancing between crusades and profitable trade deals with the Turks. Poland and Lithuania were preoccupied with their eastern problems. The papal throne in Rome called for unity in the face of the crescent moon, but its cries drowned in a swamp of feudal intrigues and mutual distrust. In this grand chess game, Wallachia, Vlad's homeland, was nothing more than a pawn, squeezed between 2 titans, Catholic Hungary to the north and the Muslim Ottoman Empire to the south. It was a bloodland, a buffer zone doomed to perpetual war. Its rulers had to be less like monarchs and more like tightrope walkers, navigating between betrayal and submission. It was in this world, where loyalty was a currency with a fluctuating exchange rate, and where the survival of an entire people depended on the cunning and cruelty of its leader, that a man had to emerge who was willing to pay any price for independence. Vlad III did not appear from nowhere. Behind him stood the shadows of his ancestors and the powerful, ambiguous legacy of his father, Vlad II, who bore the nickname Dracula. This name, which would become synonymous with terror, was originally a symbol of honor. In 1431, the year of our hero's birth, his father was inducted into the elite knightly Order of the Dragon, created by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg. The order's purpose was to protect Christianity from pagans and heretics, primarily the Ottoman threat. Members of the order, the flower of European aristocracy, wore medallions depicting a dragon, its cross-like shape inverted. The symbolism was clear. The dragon is the ancient serpent, a symbol of evil, and the knights of the order were called to crush it. However, in the Romanian language, the word Dracul had a dual meaning. It meant not only the dragon, but also the devil. Thus, Vlad II, proudly minting coins with the dragon's image, unintentionally cast a seal of ambiguity upon his family line. His son, Vlad III, would inherit this nickname with the suffix "a", meaning son of. Dracula, son of the dragon, or son of the devil. This linguistic paradox would become prophetic for his entire destiny. He, like his father, would fight under the banner of defending the faith, but the methods he chose would lead many to see in him not a divine warrior, but the devil incarnate. The Basarab dynasty, to which he belonged, was known for its brutal power struggles. The Wallachian throne was not inherited in a strict sense. It was seized by force, and every claimant from the numerous branches of the family felt entitled to hire Turkish or Hungarian troops to slaughter their relatives. From infancy, Vlad absorbed this atmosphere of betrayal and bloody feuds. He watched his father be overthrown. He saw his older brother and father ultimately betrayed and murdered by their own boyars. The legacy of the dragon was not just an oath to protect the cross, but also a curse, dooming him to an eternal struggle not only with the external enemy, but with the internal one, the venomous serpent of treason in his own home. The fate of Vlad Dracula feels almost like an ancient tragedy, where destiny relentlessly guides the hero along a predetermined path. Born in the Transylvanian city of Sighișoara, in the very heart of the lands that would one day become the setting for the Gothic novel about him, he was at the epicenter of a great collision from his first days. The very fact that his father joined the Order of the Dragon in the year of his birth was not just a political act, but a baptism by fire and sword. It was an omen that defined his entire future life as an endless war. He was not born for peace, but for battle. His lullaby was the ring of steel, and the horizon of his childhood was shrouded in the smoke of burning villages. The legends that envelop his figure, though they arose later, accurately reflect this sense of fatality. It was said that on the day of his birth, the sky over Sighișoara was crimson, like blood, and wolves howled in the mountains, as if welcoming their future master. While this is likely poetic fiction, it captures the essence. Vlad's appearance was perceived as an extraordinary event. He was born under the sign of the serpent, a symbol of both wisdom and temptation, protection and destruction. His entire life would become an embodiment of this duality. He would protect his people with the wisdom of a serpent, using cunning, ambushes, and psychological warfare. But at the same time, his methods would be so cruel that they would seem a diabolical temptation, a step beyond what was permissible even in the most desperate struggle. His destiny was forged not only by the stars, but by harsh reality. He was to become Wallachia's sword, its shield, and, if necessary, its fiery scourge, burning out corruption from both within and without. This role required not just a ruler, but a symbol, a living embodiment of the nation's will to survive. And Vlad accepted this burden, turning his life into a bloody saga of defending his homeland, where the line between heroism and monstrosity was blurred beyond recognition. If there was one period in Vlad Dracula's life that could be called the forge of his character, it was the years of his youth spent as a political hostage at the court of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II. In 1442, when Vlad was just 11, his father, trying to maintain a fragile peace and his throne, was forced to send his two sons, Vlad and his younger brother Radu, to Adrianople, the Ottoman capital at the time. This was not just a diplomatic move, it was a golden cage, where the young princes were meant to guarantee their father's loyalty. But for Vlad, this cage became his university of hatred and power. He saw firsthand the full might of the Ottoman military and administrative machine, the discipline of the janissaries, the efficiency of the tax system, the unquestioning obedience to the Sultan's will. He observed court intrigues, saw how easily human life was devalued in the struggle for power, and learned the ultimate lesson. True power is built not on the love of subjects, but on their fear and on absolute centralized control. He studied the Quran, the Turkish language, and military tactics, but his main subject was the art of survival and imperial governance. He watched how the Ottomans treated their enemies, how they used public executions and terror not for sadistic pleasure, but as a calculated and effective tool of state policy to suppress dissent and intimidate opponents. It was there, in the heart of the enemy, that he realized such a force could only be defeated with its own weapons, by surpassing it in cruelty and organization. His younger brother Radu, nicknamed the Handsome, chose a different path. He succumbed to the charm of Ottoman culture, converted to Islam, and became a friend and favorite of the heir to the throne, the future Mehmed II. For Vlad, this was yet another betrayal, strengthening his conviction that he could trust only himself. The years spent in the Ottoman cage burned away all sentimentality in his soul, leaving only a cold, calculating mind and a boiling, suppressed hatred. He emerged not broken, but tempered like a blade, ready to strike down both his captors and those in his own country whom he considered too weak or corrupt. His release from Ottoman captivity did not bring Vlad peace. It threw him directly into the boiling cauldron of Wallachian politics, where betrayal was the norm and the life of a ruler was often short and brutal. In 1447, his father, Vlad Dracula, and his older brother Mircea were brutally murdered. His father was buried alive, and his brother was blinded and then buried, following a conspiracy by Wallachian boyars dissatisfied with his policies, in league with the Hungarian warlord John Hunyadi. This news was not just a personal tragedy for Vlad, but a key political lesson. The most dangerous enemy is not the foreign invader, but one's own nobleman, ready to sell the country for titles and gold. The following year, in 1448, with the support of a Turkish contingent, provided more to destabilize the region than out of any sympathy for him, Vlad made his first attempt to seize the throne. It was a daring but poorly prepared venture. He managed to briefly oust the Hungarian-backed ruler, but was forced to flee after just 2 months, lacking sufficient support within the country. This short, 2-month reign was his baptism by fire. He tasted power for the first time, and the bitterness of exile. He understood that a Turkish saber could help him take the throne, but he could only hold it by relying on his own strength and by crushing the resistance of the boyar oligarchy. The years of exile that followed this failure were spent wandering neighboring courts, including Moldavia, ruled by his cousin. He watched, he learned, he accumulated rage, and he nurtured his plans for revenge. This experience of first blood and first betrayal definitively shaped his political creed. No mercy for enemies, no trust for boyars, no dependence on foreign patrons. To save Wallachia, it first had to be cleansed with fire and sword, creating a state with a single, indisputable will, his will. It was then that the idea was born in him that order and independence were worth any sacrifice, and that he, Vlad Dracula, was prepared to make those sacrifices, both of others and of himself. Behind the stern and cruel facade of Vlad Tepes hid not just a lust for power, but a deep, almost pathological obsession with the idea of order. This was not the abstract justice described in philosophical treatises, but a painfully concrete understanding of how a state must function to survive in a ruthless world. His inner demon, his secret motivation, was not so much revenge for his father and brother as an all-consuming hatred of chaos. He saw chaos everywhere, in the corruption of the boyars, who placed their clan interests above the country's, in the laziness and theft of the commoners, which he believed weakened the state from within, in the indecisiveness of European monarchs, unable to unite against a common threat. To him, this chaos was a mortal disease, a cancer on the body of Wallachia, and he saw himself as the only surgeon capable of cutting it out. His methods were horrifying, but in his own twisted logic, they were perfectly consistent. He impaled people not because he enjoyed suffering, but because he considered it the most effective medicine. The stake was not just an execution, it was a symbol. It symbolized the inevitability of punishment, its public nature, and a terror designed to paralyze the will of anyone who dared to defy his established order. The legend of the Golden Cup, left in the central square of Targoviste, from which anyone could drink and which no one dared to steal during his entire reign, is the perfect illustration of his goal. He sought to create a sterile, perfectly functioning society where the fear of punishment completely eradicated the very thought of a crime. This obsession with order bordered on madness, but it was precisely this obsession that drove both his great achievements and his monstrous atrocities. He wanted to burn out the chaos, but to do so, he himself had to become the embodiment of chaos for his enemies, turning his country into an iron, disciplined fortress where every resident knew their place and the price of disobedience. Returning to the Wallachian throne in 1456, this time with Hungarian support, Vlad Dracula did not intend to repeat past mistakes. He knew his main enemy was not across the Danube, but in the banquet halls of his own capital. The boyar clans, accustomed to changing princes like gloves during decades of turmoil, considered him just another temporary figure. They were fatally mistaken. Vlad waited, watching and memorizing the names of those who had betrayed his family and who posed the greatest threat to his power. The climax came on Easter Sunday, 1457. Dracula invited hundreds of boyars and their families to a grand feast in Targoviste, when the guests, drunk on wine and their own power, felt completely secure. The prince asked them one question: "How many princes do you remember on this throne?" Their boastful answers, in which they listed how many rulers they had outlived and overthrown, became their death sentence. At Vlad's signal, guards burst into the hall. This was not merely an execution, it was an act of total annihilation of the old aristocracy. According to the chronicles, the older boyars, guilty of his father's and brother's deaths, were immediately impaled right in front of the palace. Those who were younger and healthier, along with their wives and daughters, still in their festive clothes, were marched north into the mountains to build his new fortress, Poenari. Many died on the way from exhaustion and crushing labor. Their bodies were left on the roadsides as a lesson to others. This Easter purge was a monstrous but brilliant political move. In one stroke, Vlad beheaded the opposition, confiscated their lands and wealth to fill his treasury, and replaced the old, disloyal aristocracy with new men, vitegi, or minor nobles and even commoners, who owed their advancement to him personally and were boundlessly loyal. Wallachia ceased to be a feudal anarchy. On the bones of the old aristocracy, a new, absolute monarchy was born, where the prince's will was the only law. He had proven that his power was here to stay, and the price of challenging it was an agonizing death. Having secured his power at home with an iron fist, Vlad Dracula transformed Wallachia from a strife-torn buffer zone into a serious geopolitical player, one that both the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary had to reckon with. His policy was simple and effective: centralization of power, a strengthened army, and economic independence. He created a new, loyal aristocracy and reorganized the military, relying not on boyar retinues, but on a militia of free peasants and mercenaries loyal to him personally. His reforms were aimed at turning Wallachia into a unified military camp, ready to mobilize at any moment to repel a threat. On the Danube, which bordered the Ottoman Empire, he built a system of watchtowers and fortified strongholds, creating an effective line of defense. But his ambitions went beyond simply securing borders. He understood that economic dependence was the first step toward political submission. Vlad entered into a fierce conflict with the Transylvanian Saxon merchants from the cities of Brasov and Sibiu, who enjoyed enormous trade privileges in Wallachia, effectively monopolizing its economy and siphoning its wealth. He revoked their privileges, imposed high tariffs, and began to promote his own Wallachian merchants. It was a bold and risky move. The Saxons, who held immense influence and connections in Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, responded not only with a trade blockade, but with an information war, one that would ultimately create his monstrous image in the West. But in the short term, his policy bore fruit. The treasury filled, and dependence on neighbors decreased. Wallachia, under his iron fist, became a bone in the throat of two empires. For the Ottomans, it was a rebellious vassal and a dangerous staging ground for future crusades. For the Hungarians, it was an unpredictable and overly independent ally who could disrupt their own plans at any moment. Vlad forced everyone to respect him, and in the 15th century, respect was synonymous with fear. Vlad Tepes' military genius was not found in large-scale field battles, where he could not compete with the vast Ottoman armies, but in asymmetrical guerrilla warfare and daring, lightning-fast raids. The most striking example of his tactical brilliance was the famous night attack on the camp of Sultan Mehmed II in June 1462. By this time, Mehmed, enraged by Vlad's defiance, had gathered an enormous army, estimated at 60 to 150,000 men, and personally led a punitive campaign into Wallachia. Vlad's forces were incomparably smaller, no more than 30,000. Realizing he was doomed in an open fight, Dracula chose a scorched earth tactic. He retreated deep into the country, destroying crops, poisoning wells, and launching constant ambushes on Ottoman foraging parties. But his main plan was far more audacious. On the night of June 17th, Vlad, disguised in Turkish clothing, personally scouted the massive Ottoman camp, identifying the location of the Sultan's tent. After returning, he selected several thousand of his most elite warriors and, under cover of darkness, led them in a suicide attack. The goal was not to defeat the army, but to kill the Sultan and sow panic. The Wallachian horsemen, knowing the Turkish passwords, burst into the center of the camp, causing unimaginable chaos. In the darkness, the Turks began fighting each other, unable to tell friend from foe. Vlad and his men cut down everyone in their path, fighting their way toward Mehmed's tent. They almost succeeded. They ravaged the vizier's tents but failed to reach the sultan, who was saved by his loyal janissaries. At dawn, having inflicted huge losses on the enemy while suffering minimal casualties themselves, Dracula's unit melted back into the forests as suddenly as they had appeared. The military effect of the attack was significant, but the psychological one was colossal. The conqueror of Constantinople himself, master of 2 seas and 2 continents, had nearly been killed in his own tent by the ruler of a tiny principality. This audacity stunned the Ottomans, showing them they were fighting not a normal army, but a ghost, an elusive and merciless devil who knew no fear and followed no rules of war. In the great geopolitical game of the mid-15th century, Vlad Dracula was surrounded by figures of titanic scale, and his fate was inextricably linked to his relationships with them. His main and existential enemy was, without a doubt, Sultan Mehmed II, Fatih, the conqueror. They were nearly the same age and may have even known each other as youths at Murad II's court. But now they were polar opposites, 2 sides of the same coin. Mehmed was an empire builder, a brilliant strategist, and a patron of the sciences, but also a ruthless conqueror who had crushed the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire. Vlad was the desperate defender of his tiny homeland, using terror as the only weapon available to him against imperial might. Their confrontation was not just a war, but a personal duel between 2 absolute wills. Another key figure on the chessboard was the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, the son of John Hunyadi, who had once been complicit in the death of Vlad's father. The relationship between Vlad and Matthias was a complex tangle of alliance and betrayal. Matthias, an enlightened Renaissance monarch, saw Vlad as a valuable vassal, a guard dog protecting Hungary's southern border from the Turks. He supported Vlad with money and troops, but always kept him on a short leash, never allowing him to become too powerful. Vlad, in turn, needed Hungary's support, but despised having to submit to a king he considered little more than a schemer. The third force that played a fatal role in Dracula's destiny was the Transylvanian Saxon merchants. These pragmatic and wealthy townsmen from Brasov and Sibiu were interested only in their profits. When Vlad's protectionist policies hit their wallets, they turned from allies into mortal enemies. It was they who, using the newly invented Gutenberg printing press, would launch the first black PR campaign in history, printing and spreading pamphlets across Germany with gruesome stories of the atrocities of Dracula, the tyrant. Thus, Vlad found himself trapped in a 3-front game: a military front against the Sultan, a political front against his own allied king, and an information front against a powerful merchant lobby. This chess match was doomed to a tragic end. The turning point, the point of no return in Vlad's confrontation with the Ottoman Empire, was his open and defiant refusal to pay tribute. Since his second ascension in 1456, Dracula had formally remained a vassal of the Sultan, regularly paying the jizya, a tax non-Muslim rulers paid for the protection of the port. It was a humiliating but pragmatic measure that bought him time to strengthen his state. However, by the winter of 1461, Vlad felt strong enough to throw down the gauntlet. When Ottoman envoys arrived in Targovishte, demanding not only the payment of tribute arrears, but also a levy of 500 boys for the Janissary Corps, and for Vlad himself to appear before the Sultan to pay homage. Dracula knew the moment of choice had come. To submit would mean not just humiliation, but the effective loss of sovereignty, turning Wallachia into an ordinary Ottoman province. To refuse meant certain war with the greatest military power in the world. According to legend, Vlad gave the envoys a cruel reception. When they refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing their custom, he ordered their custom to be strengthened by nailing the turbans to their heads. This barbaric act, whether real or symbolic, perfectly represents his answer. It was not just a refusal, but a slap in the face, a public insult that Mehmed II could not forgive. Immediately after, Vlad went on the offensive. In a sudden winter raid, he crossed the frozen Danube, invaded Ottoman territory in Bulgaria, and unleashed a horrific slaughter, destroying Turkish garrisons and exterminating the population. In his letter to Matthias Corvinus, he reported his success with chilling precision, listing the number of infidels killed, over 23,000 people, not counting those who burned in their homes. This act was both a death sentence for himself and a desperate act of salvation. He was burning all his bridges, deliberately provoking the Sultan into a massive war, hoping his audacity would finally force Christian Europe to wake up and come to his aid. The apex of terror, the culmination of Vlad Dracula's psychological warfare, and the event that would forever imprint his name in the annals of global cruelty, was the creation of that very forest of the Impaled in the spring of 1462. After Vlad's daring winter raid, Sultan Mehmed II's response was predictable. He gathered a gigantic army and marched on Wallachia to wipe it off the map. Vlad, using guerrilla tactics, wore down the Ottoman army, but he knew he needed one. Devastating blow to the enemy's morale. His chance came when he managed to lure a large Turkish detachment under the command of Hamza Pasha into an ambush and completely annihilate it. Instead of simply killing the prisoners, Vlad decided to turn their execution into a grand spectacle of terror. By his command, on a field near his capital of Târgoviște, his soldiers and engineers created a monstrous installation. About 20,000 Turkish prisoners, including Hamza Pasha himself, were impaled on stakes of varying heights to create the illusion of a giant, dead forest. The height of the stake corresponded to the victim's rank. The Pasha was raised highest of all. This was not a chaotic massacre, but a carefully planned and orchestrated performance. When the vanguard of Mehmed's army approached the site, the soldiers were paralyzed with horror. It was not a battlefield. It was hell on earth. The sight of thousands of decomposing, impaled bodies, the stench, the swarms of flies, it was all calculated to break the will of even the most hardened warriors. And it worked. The Sultan himself, as the chronicles say, was shaken to his core, admitting he could not wage war against a man capable of such an act. In this forest of the Impaled, the entire essence of Dracula's paradox was revealed. From a military perspective, it was a brilliant move that demoralized a superior enemy army and perhaps saved Wallachia from total annihilation. But from a human perspective, it was the act of a monster who had crossed every conceivable line. He used terror as an instrument of state policy, turning cruelty into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. It is this very image of the ruler feasting among his enemies dying on stakes that would become the foundation of his dark legend. While Vlad Dracula was waging his bloody war on the Danube, another, no less dangerous war was being waged against him to the north, in the printing presses of German cities, an information war. Its weapons were not swords and spears, but lead-type and the Gutenberg press, one of the greatest inventions of the era, which in this case served to create one of history's greatest monsters. Vlad's main enemies on this front were the Transylvanian Saxon merchants. Insulted and ruined by his protectionist policies, and terrified by his brutal punitive raids on Brasov and Sibiu, where he impaled their compatriots in retaliation for supporting his political rivals, the Saxons decided to destroy his reputation. Starting in the 1460s, they began to mass print and distribute short pamphlets, known as flying leaflets, throughout the Holy Roman Empire. These pamphlets, written in German and often accompanied by gruesome woodcut illustrations, described the real and imagined atrocities of Dracula, tyrant Dracula, in sadistic detail. They told stories of how he roasted babies and forced their mothers to eat their flesh, how he feasted among forests of the impaled, dipping his bread in the blood of his victims, how he burned the poor and disabled alive to rid the country of its burdens. These stories, where truth was mixed with the wildest fabrications, were written in a vivid, accessible style and instantly became bestsellers. The common European citizen, who knew nothing of the complex political situation in the Balkans, was given a ready-made image of absolute evil, the devil in the flesh. This was one of the first large-scale black PR campaigns in history, and it was incredibly successful. While for his own people, Vlad was a harsh but just ruler and a defender against the Ottomans, for Western Europe, thanks to the printing press, he was transforming into a bloodthirsty maniac and sadist. It is this German propagandistic image, not the real historical figure, that would form the basis of future legends, and ultimately turn the Wallachian prince into an immortal vampire. At the most critical moment of the war with the Ottoman Empire, in the summer of 1462, as Vlad Dracula was bleeding his country dry to hold back Mehmed II's army, fate dealt him a blow from the one direction he expected help. His ally, the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, committed an act of monstrous betrayal that changed the course of history and largely sealed the Wallachian prince's fate. Matthias had received significant funds from Pope Pius II to organize a crusade against the Turks, and everyone expected his army to march south to join Vlad's forces for a combined strike. Vlad desperately awaited this help. His entire strategy of wearing down the enemy was based on the arrival of Hungarian troops. However, Matthias Corvinus had his own, far more cynical goals. Instead of going to war, he led his army into Transylvania and simply stopped, waiting to see how the fight between Dracula and the Sultan would end. He was not interested in his defiant vassal becoming too powerful. When it became clear that Vlad, despite his heroic resistance, could not defeat Mehmed alone, and that the Sultan had decided to place Vlad's more pliable younger brother, Radu the Handsome, on the Wallachian throne, Matthias made his move. He met Vlad, not as an ally, but as an accused man. Presenting forged letters, supposedly written by Dracula to the Sultan, in which he offered his help in conquering Hungary, Matthias accused him of high treason. It was an absurd lie. Vlad was Mehmed's most hated enemy. But for the Hungarian king, it was a convenient excuse to get rid of a troublesome ally, pocket the money intended for the crusade, and justify his own inaction to the Pope. Vlad Dracula, the hero of Christendom, who had just stopped the army of the conqueror of Constantinople, was arrested on the orders of a Christian king. This Judas kiss was a catastrophe for him. He lost his throne, his freedom, and most importantly, his faith in the unity of the Christian world. The arrest by order of Matthias Corvinus opened the darkest and most mysterious chapter in Vlad Dracula's life. For 13 long years, from 1462 to 1475, He was imprisoned in Hungary, primarily in the royal castle of Visegrad. This was a period of his physical decline, and simultaneously, the time of his dark legend's birth. Deprived of power, an army, and the ability to fight, the dragon was locked in a cage. What happened to him during these years? Historical records are scarce and contradictory. Some sources claim his conditions were relatively mild, especially after he agreed to convert to Catholicism and married a relative of the Hungarian king, which eventually allowed him to move to house arrest in Pest. However, Russian chronicles paint a far more sinister picture. According to the Tale of Dracula the Voivode, even in captivity, he could not shed his thirst for cruelty. It was said that he would catch mice, birds, and other small animals and impale them on tiny stakes or chop them to pieces, finding his only solace in this. This image is likely a literary exaggeration, but it accurately reflects how his figure was being mythologized. While the real Vlad languished in captivity, his printed image, created by Saxon propaganda, lived its own life, gathering new and bloodier details. The stories of his atrocities became an integral part of European folklore. It was during this period of silence, when his real deeds had faded into the past and he himself had vanished from the political stage, that the soil for the future vampire legend was prepared. His confinement in a dungeon, his separation from the world, the rumors of his strange and cruel amusements, all this created an aura of mystery and otherworldly horror. 13 years in the shadows transformed a living, breathing, albeit cruel, ruler into a mythical monster, whose crimes in the popular imagination went far beyond human limits. The dragon had faded, but from his shadow, the vampire was being born. Paradoxically, while in Western Europe the image of Vlad as a bloodthirsty sadist was being formed thanks to German pamphlets, on the other side of the continent, in Rus, his story received a completely different interpretation. In the late 15th century, at the court of the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III, a literary work appeared known as The Tale of Dracula the Voivode. Its author is believed to be the Russian diplomat Fyodor Kurytsin, who had visited Hungary and collected stories about the Wallachian ruler. The tale is a collection of anecdotes and stories about Dracula's reign, and while it does not deny his monstrous cruelty, it presents it from a completely different angle. In the Russian version, Dracula appears not as a madman, but as a wise, though extraordinarily harsh, tyrant ruler. His cruelty here is not an end in itself, but a tool for establishing perfect order and justice in a country torn by strife. Every execution, every atrocity in the tale has its own logic and moral. He executes an unfaithful wife because she violated the sanctity of marriage. He burns the poor and infirm to rid the country of those who are not useful. He impales a thieving merchant to eradicate dishonesty. He executes a monk who condemned his cruelty for hypocrisy. In this interpretation, Vlad becomes the embodiment of the strong, authoritarian power that so appealed to the Muscovite czars during their period of state centralization. He is a terror to the boyars and criminals, a protector of the common people, and a guarantor of stability. The famous story of the golden cup that no one dared to steal is the quintessence of this image. Thus, the same figure gave birth to two completely opposite myths. For Europe, he became a symbol of irrational, Gothic horror. For Russia, he became an example of effective state management through fear, the archetype of the just tyrant. This proves that the perception of historical figures depends not so much on their actual deeds as on the cultural and political context in which their story is told. The central question posed by the history of Vlad Tepes is this: was his legendary cruelty the cold, calculated pragmatism of a brilliant ruler, or was it the manifestation of a deep personal pathology, the madness of a sadist who reveled in the suffering of others? The answer most likely lies somewhere in the middle, in the complex and agonizing dialectic of these two extremes. Undoubtedly, there was an element of ruthless pragmatism in his actions. Vlad ruled in an era when human life was cheap and violence was the universal language of politics. He came to power in a country ravaged by decades of feudal anarchy, where boyar clans betrayed and murdered princes for their own gain. His terror against the aristocracy, however monstrous, had a clear political goal: to break the oligarchy and build a centralized state capable of resisting external threats. His famous stakes were not just instruments of execution, but powerful tools of psychological warfare. The forest of 20,000 Turks was designed not to inflict maximum suffering, but to inspire maximum terror and paralyze the enemy's will. In this sense, his cruelty was rational and had concrete, measurable results. However, to reduce everything to pragmatism is to simplify his figure. There is evidence to suggest that he derived a certain twisted pleasure from his methods. The stories, even if exaggerated by propaganda, of him feasting among the dying on stakes or ordering turbans nailed to envoys' heads, speak of a man who didn't just use terror, but also found a dark aesthetic in it. The years spent as a hostage to the Turks, the betrayal and murder of his family, the constant threat to his own life. All of this could have caused severe psychological trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, which manifested as an obsessive need for control and order through violence. Perhaps he was both: a brilliant politician who understood that in his world, survival meant becoming more terrifying than his enemies, and at the same time, a deeply traumatized man whose soul had been mutilated by violence, and he could only respond to the world in the one language it had taught him. Beyond the high-profile military victories and shocking executions, Vlad Tepes's reign was marked by profound internal reforms aimed at creating a new state founded on order, discipline, and total control. His domestic policy was, in essence, an economy of terror, where fear was the main driver of social and economic processes. Vlad sincerely believed that the country's prosperity was impossible without the complete eradication of crime, corruption, and even laziness. He waged a merciless war on theft. Anyone caught stealing, regardless of social status, was immediately sent to the stake. The legend of the Golden Cup, which anyone could take but no one dared, is the perfect symbol of his success in this area. He created an atmosphere in society where honesty was not a virtue, but an instinct for self-preservation. His methods for dealing with poverty were no less radical. According to one of the darkest legends, he once summoned all the beggars, vagrants, and cripples to a large hall under the pretext of a feast. After they had eaten and drunk their fill, he asked them if they wanted to be free of their earthly suffering forever. Receiving their joyful assent, he ordered the doors and windows boarded up and set the building on fire, declaring that he was freeing them from their torments and ridding the country of a burden. This act, if it occurred, demonstrates his utilitarian and inhuman approach to society. Anything that did not benefit the state must be destroyed. He also encouraged labor and crafts, punishing idleness severely. His protectionist policy against the Saxon merchants was part of the same plan, to strengthen Wallachia's economy and make it self-sufficient. He built a new state literally on bones and fear, but in his twisted logic, it was the only possible way. He was a social engineer who tried to create a perfect society with an axe and a stake. And, as horrifying as it is to admit, for a short time, he succeeded. Under his rule, Wallachia became one of the safest and most orderly countries in Europe. But the price of that order was unbearably high. Despite the monstrous reputation he acquired in the West, Vlad Dracula himself most likely saw himself in a completely different light. In his own mind, he was not a sadist or a tyrant, but the last true warrior of Christ, an unbreakable shield protecting Europe from the Islamic tide. This self-perception was reinforced by his entire life and his policies. He was the son of a knight of the Order of the Dragon, an order created specifically to fight the enemies of Christianity. He spent his entire adult life at war with the Ottoman Empire, which he perceived not just as a political opponent, but as an existential threat to all of Christian civilization. His letters to European monarchs, especially to Matthias Corvinus and the Pope, are full of passionate rhetoric about defending the faith. He constantly emphasizes that his small Wallachia is the gateway to Christendom, and if that gate falls, all of Europe will be under threat. He proudly reports on the thousands of infidels he has killed, presenting his bloody raids not as acts of aggression, but as a sacred duty, a God-pleasing deed. His conversion to Catholicism during his Hungarian captivity, while most likely a politically motivated move to gain his freedom, also fits this logic. For him, the denominational differences between Catholics and Orthodox were secondary to the main task: the unity of all Christians in the face of a common threat. He looked with contempt on other European rulers who, in his opinion, were mired in intrigues and trade deals with the Turks, betraying the holy cause. His cruelty toward his enemies, in his understanding, was not a sin, but righteous anger, the sacred fury of a warrior defending his home and his faith. He saw himself as a biblical hero, a new Gideon or Samson, given the right by God to judge and punish the enemies of his people. This image of the Athleta Christi, or champion of Christ, as defenders of the faith were sometimes called, was not a mask for him, but the essence of his identity. And herein lies one of the greatest tragedies of his figure. The man who sincerely believed himself to be a holy warrior went down in history as a henchman of the devil. For the Ottoman Empire, Vlad Tepes was not just another rebellious vassal from the Balkans. He was a phenomenon, an enemy of a completely different order, who inspired simultaneous fierce hatred, mystical terror, and a certain degree of respect. The Turks, as experienced warriors and administrators, were used to dealing with different types of opponents: the cowardly, who surrendered at the sight of their army; the corrupt, who could be bought; and the valiant, who fought by the rules and could be defeated in a fair fight. Vlad fit into none of these categories. He was absolutely incorruptible, fanatically devoted to the idea of independence, and fought with no rules at all, using methods that shocked even the Ottomans, who were no strangers to cruelty themselves. They nicknamed him Kazaklı Bey, or Kazaklı Voivode, the Impaling Prince, or Impaler Lord. This nickname, unlike the Western Tepes, which came later, was given to him by his immediate enemies and reflected the essence of their perception. He was the master of the stake. For the Ottomans, his scorched earth tactics, poisoned wells, night attacks, use of saboteurs dressed in Turkish clothes, and of course, the mass executions on stakes were not just a military strategy, but a manifestation of some diabolical, irrational malice. Sultan Mehmed II, one of the greatest military commanders of his era, faced an adversary in Vlad, who did not fear his legions and answered imperial might with total terror. The Sultan's reaction to the forest of the Impaled is telling. It was not anger, but shock and an admission that he was facing a man with an inhuman will. At the same time, the Ottomans could not help but respect his courage and military talent. They saw him as a worthy adversary, a wolf fiercely defending his lair. After his death, when his head was delivered to Istanbul, it was seen as the greatest triumph, a deliverance from a long-standing and terrible foe. In Ottoman history, he remained not as a madman, but as the most dangerous and merciless giaour, infidel, they had ever faced on the Danube, a dark and formidable reminder of the high price of conquest. The years spent in Hungarian captivity in Visegrad and Pest were a period of agonizing reflection and powerless rage for Vlad Dracula. Imagine a man whose entire life had been motion, battle, the assertion of his will, now locked within four walls, reduced to a pawn in someone else's game. He, the vanquisher of the Turks, the terror of the boyars, was now merely a guest prisoner, his fate dependent on the mercy of the king who had betrayed him. From behind his prison window, he watched as his life's work crumbled. His brother, Radu the Handsome, an Ottoman puppet, ruled in Wallachia, turning it into a subservient vassal. Christian princes continued their petty intrigues while the crescent moon penetrated deeper into Europe. Every day of captivity was torture for Vlad, a humiliation of his pride and his mission. Psychologically, it was a devastating blow. His world, built on absolute control and action, had shrunk to the size of a prison cell. It was likely during this period that his innate suspicion grew into paranoia, and his cruelty, denied an outlet on the battlefield, sublimated into the dark amusements spoken of in legends, whether real or imagined tortures of animals. He was forced to make humiliating compromises, changing his faith from Orthodoxy to Catholicism, marrying a Hungarian noblewoman. Each such step was a small death for him, a rejection of himself for the faint hope of freedom. But he did not break. He waited. For 13 years, he gathered his spite, analyzed his mistakes, and waited for his moment. This period of isolation transformed him from an impulsive warrior into an even colder and more calculating politician. He watched the world change, old enemies die, and new alliances form. He learned patience, the hardest lesson for a man of his temperament. When, in 1475, the political winds shifted and Matthias Corvinus, needing an experienced commander for a new war with the Turks, decided to release him, the man who walked out of the prison gates was not the same one who had entered 13 years earlier. This was a ghost from the past, obsessed with a single idea: to reclaim his throne and take revenge. His release from captivity in 1475 threw Vlad Dracula back into a world that seemed to have forgotten him. He was a man from another era, a relic of a time of brutal but straightforward heroism. In the 13 years of his absence, the political landscape had changed dramatically. His arch-enemy, Mehmed II, was still on the throne in Istanbul, but in Wallachia itself, a whole generation had grown up that did not know his iron hand. The country was ruled by an Ottoman puppet from the rival Danesht clan. Matthias Corvinus, who had freed him, no longer saw him as an ally, but as a tool to be used and discarded. Nevertheless, Vlad, with fanatical determination, threw himself into his last adventure. With the support of Hungarian and Moldavian troops, he invaded Wallachia. His name still inspired fear and awe. As he approached, the Turkish-backed ruler fled, and in November of 1476, Vlad Dracula ascended the throne of his ancestors for the third and final time. But it was the return of a ghost. He found a country exhausted by tributes and Ottoman domination, with boyars who had once again grown accustomed to intrigue and betrayal. He tried to rule as he had before, immediately beginning a terror campaign against the disloyal and preparing for a new war with the Turks. But he no longer had the time or the broad support he once had. He was alone. His allies, having placed him on the throne, withdrew most of their troops, leaving him virtually alone against the full might of the Ottoman Empire. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army. His last desperate attempt to reclaim the past was doomed from the start. He was fighting for a Wallachia that existed more in his memory than in reality. The world had moved on, but he remained the eternal warrior on a cursed frontier, destined for his final battle. Vlad Dracula's short third reign lasted only about 2 months and ended just as his entire political career had begun, with betrayal. He was surrounded by enemies on all sides. A massive Turkish army was already moving toward Wallachia's borders to restore its puppet to the throne. But the mortal blow, as so often happened in his life, came not from without, but from within. The Wallachian boyars, whom he had once again tried to bring to heel, did not want a return of his iron order. They preferred a weaker, more predictable ruler, even if he was a vassal of the sultan, to the furious Dracula, whose obsession with independence threatened their wealth and their very lives. The details of his last battle are murky and contradictory, which only adds to his mystique. According to one of the most common versions, in December 1476 or January 1477 near Bucharest, Vlad's small detachment clashed with superior Turkish forces. In the heat of battle, as he was fiercely cutting down enemies, a portion of his own boyars either defected to the Turkish side or simply fled the field, leaving their prince to be slaughtered. There is another, even darker version, that he was not killed by the Turks, but by an assassin sent by the boyars, or even struck down from behind by one of his own men who mistook him for a Turk in the fray. Regardless of the specific circumstances, the outcome was the same. The dragon was defeated not so much by the strength of the enemy's weapons as by the poison of internal treason. He had spent his life fighting this hydra of boyar opposition. He had drowned it in blood and burned it with hot iron, but he could never completely destroy it. In his final battle, he fell victim to the very chaos and betrayal that he so hated and had fought so cruelly to end. His fall was the final proof that he had been right. In that world, in that country, no one could be trusted. The end of Vlad Tepes' life was as dark and symbolic as his entire reign. After his death in battle, his body was beheaded. This was a standard Ottoman custom, designed not only to confirm the death of an important enemy, but also to humiliate him posthumously. The head of the Porte's most terrifying enemy on the Danube was preserved in honey to prevent decay and sent to Istanbul as a precious trophy. There, by order of Sultan Mehmed II, it was displayed for all to see on a high stake, so that every inhabitant of the empire, from the vizier to the commoner, could be certain. Kazaklı Bey was dead. His terrible reign was over. For the Sultan, this was not just a military victory, but a personal triumph, the symbolic conclusion of their long-standing confrontation. He had finally overcome the man who had made his army shudder in horror before the forest of the Impaled, and who had nearly killed him in his own tent. This ironic end underscores the entire paradox of Dracula's life. The man who fought so fiercely for his land's independence from the Ottomans ultimately served as their greatest triumph. the defender of Christianity, whose head should have been crowned with laurels, ended up on a pike in the capital of the Muslim Empire. The warrior, cut down by the very people he tried to save, his own boyar countrymen, was posthumously humiliated by his greatest enemy. This final act of the drama was a perfect rhyme to the beginning of his journey. He began his political life as a hostage in the Ottoman Empire and ended it as a trophy, displayed for the amusement of a crowd in its capital. The circle was complete. The physical existence of Vlad Dracula had ended, but it was at this very moment that his immortality in myth and legend began. With a man's death, his true life in history begins, and the fate of Vlad Tepes' remains became the prologue to his immortal myth. The exact location of his grave remains one of the greatest mysteries in Romanian history. According to the most common version, his headless body was secretly recovered by loyal monks and buried in the monastery on the island of Snagov, located on a lake north of Bucharest. This monastery had long enjoyed Dracula's patronage, and the choice of this location seems logical. However, when Romanian archaeologists opened the supposed tomb before the altar of the monastery church in 1933, they found it empty. In another, more modest grave near the church entrance, remains were found that some researchers hastened to attribute to Vlad, but no convincing evidence was ever presented. The empty tomb at Snagov became the perfect soil for supernatural legends to be born. To the common people, it was a sign. Such a man could not have died a normal death. His soul was either cursed and dragged to hell, or he himself had become something else, an unquiet spirit, doomed to wander the earth forever. The absence of a body, the mysterious circumstances of his death, and the aura of monstrous cruelty that surrounded his name, all were perfect ingredients for a folklore myth. Peasants in Carpathian villages began to pass down stories of the strigoi, the living dead who drink blood, and the image of the cruel ruler gradually began to merge with these ancient superstitions. The death of Vlad, the man, became the birth of Dracula, the symbol. His historical personality began to dissolve, giving way to an archetype that could contain all the fears and prejudices of the era. The empty grave became the cradle for the vampire, proof that the evil he represented could not simply be buried and forgotten. It was immortal. Centuries passed, and the figure of Vlad Tepes fractured in history's mirror into two incompatible reflections, existing in parallel. For the modern West, thanks to the efforts first of Saxon pamphleteers and later of the Irish writer Bram Stoker, with his 1897 novel Dracula, his name became an absolute synonym for evil. Stoker, though he didn't delve too deeply into historical details, took the most important elements: the ominous name, the Transylvanian setting, and the reputation for monstrous cruelty, creating from this foundation the archetypal vampire, an aristocratic, immortal, and bloodthirsty monster. This image proved so powerful that it completely supplanted the real historical figure. For billions of people on the planet, Dracula is not a 15th century Wallachian prince, but a fictional character, an inhabitant of a castle in the Carpathians. In this paradigm, he is a monster, a villain, the anti-hero of a Gothic fairy tale. However, in his native Romania, the perception is completely different. Here, he is primarily Vlad Tepes, not Dracula. In the 19th century, during the period of national revival and the struggle for independence from the Ottoman Empire, Romanian historians and poets rediscovered his figure. They saw in him not a monster, but a tragic national hero, a stern but just ruler who was the first to dare to challenge the mighty Porte, and who gave his life for his homeland's freedom. His cruelty, in this context, is reinterpreted as a necessary measure, a forced response to the cruelty of the age and the betrayal of the boyars. For Romanians, he is a symbol of the uncompromising struggle for independence, the strong leader their country so often lacked in its subsequent history. They erect monuments to him, name streets after him, and print his portrait on stamps. Thus, the same man lives two completely different lives in the collective memory of humanity. In the West, he is the king of horror. In his homeland, he is a founding father of the nation. This striking dualism perfectly illustrates just how subjective and malleable historical truth can be. And so, we return to the main question embedded in our narrative's title. Why did the defender of the faith and the savior of Wallachia become known to the world as Tepes, the sadist? The solution to this paradox is multi-layered and lies in the tragic fusion of three powerful forces: his own undeniably brutal methods, deliberate enemy propaganda, and finally, the genius of literary mystification. First, it cannot be denied that Vlad himself provided the soil for his dark legend. His methods of ruling and waging war were extreme, even for his brutal century. Mass impalements, total terror as a tool of state policy, mercilessness toward enemies both foreign and domestic, all of this was real. He truly was a ruthless ruler who believed that the goal, the salvation of the state, justified absolutely any means. He was a savior, but his salvation was bloody and terrible. Second, this fertile ground was sown by a powerful information war, one of the first in history. The Saxon merchants, using the revolutionary technology of the printing press, created and mass-produced the image of Dracula the monster, exaggerating his real atrocities many times over and adding fictional, sadistic details. This image proved to be extremely resilient and spread throughout Europe, shaping his reputation for centuries to come. Third, 400 years later, this ready-made myth of a cruel ruler from distant Transylvania fell into the hands of Bram Stoker. The writer completed the transformation, definitively tearing Dracula from his historical context and turning him into a supernatural creature, a vampire. The novel's literary success cemented this image in global pop culture, making it immortal. Thus, the paradox is resolved. The savior's cruelty became the raw material for his enemies' propaganda, and that propaganda, in turn, served as the inspiration for a literary myth that consumed the historical truth. He became known as the Impaler, not because he wasn't a savior, but because his methods of salvation were so horrific that they were easily portrayed as the work of the devil, and his enemies possessed a weapon more powerful than his sword, the printing press. The story of Vlad Tepes, the Dragon of Wallachia, leaves us with a deep and unsettling philosophical question that extends far beyond the 15th century. It is a story about the price of survival. It asks the eternal question: where is the line where a defender, using the methods of a monster, becomes a monster himself? And does history, judging from a safe future, have the right to condemn a choice made at the edge of the abyss? Vlad was a product of his time, an era of absolute total violence, where nations were born and died in fire and blood. He responded to an existential threat to his homeland with existential violence. For his people, who faced a choice between extermination, assimilation, and desperate resistance, he was not a monster, but an immune system, a painful but necessary reaction to a deadly infection. He proved that a small nation could resist a giant empire if its will to be free was concentrated in one man willing to do anything. But the lesson of Tepes is also this: history is written not only by the victors, but also by those who shout the loudest. His military victories proved powerless against the print runs of German pamphlets. His tragedy is the tragedy of a leader whose deeds were so radical that they could not be fit into the simple framework of good and evil. He is forever stuck in history's purgatory, simultaneously a hero and a villain, a savior and a sadist. His fate is an eternal reminder that the path to salvation sometimes leads through hell, and that the price a nation pays for its survival is sometimes the immortality of its leader in the image of a monster. And looking at his story through the centuries, we are forced to ask ourselves, how many other Draculas has history produced? And how many have we simply misunderstood, condemning them without ever feeling the scimitar at our necks that they managed to stop?